The sharp screech of motorcycle tires shattered the tranquil morning outside the Sunrise Café, a quaint diner nestled in a small town square. Inside, the clinking of forks on plates and the low hum of conversation came to an abrupt halt. 5 burly bikers stormed through the door, their heavy boots thudding against the polished wooden floor. Dressed in black leather jackets adorned with patches and tattoos that told a lifetime of reckless adventures, they brought with them the acrid stench of gasoline and bravado. Maggie Carter, a 60-year-old waitress with a kind smile and a steadfast demeanor, stood behind the counter. She had worked at the Sunrise Café for over 30 years, becoming a fixture in the lives of the regulars. Wiping her hands on her apron, she surveyed the scene, bracing herself for what was sure to be a challenging day. The bikers' laughter and jeering filled the air, drowning out the soft jazz that usually provided a calming backdrop to the mornings. At a corner table, a solitary man sat quietly, dressed in a casual flannel shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap that obscured much of his face. He seemed out of place yet unbothered by the commotion. He sipped his coffee and gazed out the window, his demeanor calm and detached. "Hey, buddy," barked the leader of the group, Roy, a towering man with a skull tattoo etched prominently on his forearm. He sauntered over to the stranger's table, a sly grin spreading across his face. "What's a guy like you doing in a dump like this? Shouldn't you be at some fancy coffee shop?" The man lifted his head, revealing piercing gray eyes that met Roy's with an unwavering calm. "Just enjoying my morning," he said, his voice low but steady. "Maybe you should try it too." Roy's grin vanished, replaced by a scowl. He leaned closer to the table. "Got a smart mouth, huh?" Before things could escalate further, Maggie stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. "Gentlemen, how about I get you some coffee? On the house." The bikers turned their attention to Maggie, their eyes sizing her up. Roy smirked. "Well, aren't you the brave one? Sure, bring us some coffee. And maybe a slice of pie for my friend here." He gestured toward the man at the table. Maggie didn't falter. "Coming right up," she said, turning toward the counter. Behind her, the tension in the air was palpable. The other diners watched in silence, their unease growing with every passing moment. "You should probably leave," whispered an older woman sitting at a nearby table to her husband. "This doesn't look good." At the counter, Maggie prepared the coffee with deliberate calm. She'd seen her fair share of trouble in her years working at the cafe, but something about this situation felt different. Glancing over her shoulder, she noticed the solitary man watching her. He gave her a faint nod, as if to say he appreciated her efforts. Roy's voice boomed through the cafe, drawing Maggie's attention back to the group. "So, what's your story, pal?" he asked the man, his tone mocking. "You some kind of writer? Or just hiding out from someone?" The man took another sip of his coffee, his movements unhurried. "Does it matter?" he replied, his voice calm. "Why don't you mind your own business and enjoy your coffee?" Roy slammed his hand on the table, making the dishes rattle. "Listen here, you don't talk to me like that." The room went silent. Maggie's heart pounded as she carried the coffee to their table, her hands steady despite the tension. She set the mugs down in front of the bikers. "Here you go, gentlemen. Anything else?" she asked, her voice unwavering. Roy leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. "Nah, this'll do. For now." As Maggie walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far from over. Glancing at the clock, she silently prayed for a quick resolution. But the morning was just beginning, and the day had more in store than anyone could have anticipated. Roy smirked and turned his attention to Maggie. "Well, aren't you the brave one? But we're not here for coffee, lady. We're here for some fun." His tone dripped with mockery as he reached across the table and snatched the stranger's untouched slice of apple pie. Tossing it between his hands like a toy, Roy's grin widened. "Eat it or put it down," the man said calmly. His voice cut through the tense atmosphere like a knife. The room fell silent, the weight of his words striking harder than any physical blow. Roy's smirk faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered. "And who's going to make me?" he sneered, leaning closer to the man. The other bikers chuckled, their laughter loud and grating against the uneasy quiet of the cafe. Maggie felt her pulse quicken. Every instinct told her to step back, but something deeper within her wouldn't allow it. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward. "Sir," she said, her voice firm but polite, "this is a family diner. We don't tolerate harassment here. If you don't stop, I'll have to ask you to leave." The bikers turned their attention to her, their expressions a mix of amusement and annoyance. Roy's eyes narrowed as he tilted his head, sizing her up. "Lady, you've got guts. I'll give you that. But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." He tossed the slice of pie back onto the plate, smearing crumbs across the table. "Now, why don't you run along and mind your business?" Maggie stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. "I am minding my business," she replied. "This is my cafe, and everyone here deserves to feel safe. If you're not going to order something, I'll have to ask you to leave." The other diners watched in stunned silence, their eyes darting between Maggie and the bikers. Some whispered among themselves, debating whether to intervene or quietly slip out the door. At the counter, a young couple exchanged nervous glances. Near the window, an elderly man lowered his coffee cup, his hand trembling slightly as he leaned closer to his wife. Roy's expression darkened, and he took a step toward Maggie. "You're starting to get on my nerves, lady." Before he could say more, the stranger at the corner table rose to his feet. He wasn't as physically imposing as Roy, but there was an undeniable strength in his calm demeanor. "You heard her," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "It's time for you to leave." The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Roy's face twisted in anger as he turned to face the man. "And who the hell do you think you are to tell me what to do?" he spat. The man took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. "Just someone who believes in respect," he replied. "Something you seem to have forgotten." Roy's fists clenched at his sides, but before he could act, the sound of the door opening drew everyone's attention. Two uniformed police officers stepped into the cafe, their eyes quickly scanning the room. The younger officer placed a hand on his holstered weapon, while the older one addressed the group. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but commanding. Roy sneered but stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No problem, officer. Just having a little chat." The officers exchanged glances before turning their attention to Maggie. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" the older officer asked. Maggie nodded, relief washing over her. "Yes, officers. Thank you for coming." The younger officer stepped forward. "All right, gentlemen," he said, addressing the bikers. "Time to leave. Let's go." One of the bikers, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, started to protest. "We're paying customers. You can't just—" "Now," the officer interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. The bikers grumbled but complied, their bravado deflating as they shuffled toward the door. Roy paused on his way out, turning to glare at Maggie and the stranger. "This isn't over," he muttered before disappearing into the sunlight. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the room finally began to ease. The officers stayed for a few moments, ensuring that the bikers didn't linger outside. When they were satisfied, they gave Maggie a nod and left. The diners slowly returned to their meals, though the atmosphere remained subdued. Maggie exhaled deeply, her hands trembling as she reached for a nearby table to steady herself. "Are you all right?" the stranger asked, his voice gentle. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and lingering fear. "I'm fine," she said, managing a weak smile. "Thank you for standing up to them." The man returned her smile, though his expression remained thoughtful. "It's people like you who make places like this worth visiting," he said. "You did the right thing." Maggie's smile grew, and for the first time that morning, she felt a glimmer of hope. The bikers were gone, but the impact of their presence lingered. Still, she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let fear dictate her actions. Not now, not ever. Later that day, Maggie's boss, Mr. Taylor, called her into his cramped office at the back of the cafe. His desk, cluttered with receipts and coffee-stained papers, seemed to mirror his frazzled demeanor. He gestured for her to sit down, but his tone was anything but inviting. "Maggie, what were you thinking?" he asked, his voice sharp with frustration. Maggie's heart sank as she took her seat. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing, she said softly. That man, those bikers were harassing him. Someone had to stand up to them. Mr. Taylor sighed and ran a hand through his thinning hair. Maggie, you're one of my best employees, but this isn't about heroics. This is a business. Our customers come here for peace and quiet, not to witness a showdown. He leaned forward, his expression a mix of exasperation and disappointment. Your actions scared off half the diners. Do you have any idea how much money we lost today? Her eyes stung with unshed tears, but Maggie held her ground. And what if those men had hurt someone? What if they had come back and caused more trouble? Doing nothing wasn't an option, Mr. Taylor. He shook his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. Well, your actions may have cost us more than just a few customers. I'm sorry, Maggie, but I have to let you go. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Maggie sat there, stunned, her mind racing. After 30 years of loyalty and hard work, this was how it ended. She searched his face for any sign of remorse or second thoughts, but his expression remained resolute. I understand, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Rising from her chair, she smoothed her apron and walked out of the office. The din of the cafe seemed distant as she collected her belongings. A few co-workers gave her sympathetic looks, but no one dared to speak up. Stepping outside, Maggie was greeted by the cool evening air. She paused on the sidewalk, gripping her bag tightly as tears spilled down her cheeks. Had she made a terrible mistake? Standing up for what was right had always been a guiding principle in her life, but now she wondered if it had cost her everything. That night, Maggie sat alone at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. The events of the day replayed in her mind, each moment sharper and more painful than the last. The memory of Mr. Taylor's words cut deep, but what lingered most was the look of gratitude in the stranger's eyes. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Frowning, she stood and made her way to the front door, opening it to find the man from the cafe standing on her porch. He was no longer wearing his baseball cap, and she could see him clearly now. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't place it. Good evening, Maggie, he said, his voice warm and sincere. I'm sorry to bother you, but I felt it was important to thank you again for what you did today. You didn't just stand up for me. You stood up for everyone in that cafe. Maggie blinked, her surprise rendering her momentarily speechless. How did you find me? She asked finally. The man smiled faintly. Let's just say I've got a good memory for details. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small card, handing it to her. My name is Alan Carter. I work with a foundation that focuses on supporting people who make a difference in their communities. We'd like to offer you a position with us. Maggie stared at the card, her mind struggling to process his words. I'm sorry, she said slowly. You want me to work for your foundation? Doing what? Alan's smile widened. Advocating for change, supporting local businesses, and ensuring people like you have a platform to make their voices heard. People with courage like yours are rare, Maggie. We need someone like you on our team. For the first time that day, a spark of hope flickered in Maggie's chest. I don't know what to say, she admitted. This is all so sudden. Take your time, Alan replied. But know this, what you did today mattered. And I believe it's just the beginning for you. He nodded politely and turned to leave, leaving Maggie standing in the doorway with the card clutched tightly in her hand. She watched him disappear down the street, her mind racing with possibilities. The next morning, Maggie woke with a renewed sense of purpose. She picked up her phone and dialed the number on Alan's card. By the time the call ended, she had agreed to meet with his team to discuss her potential role. As she prepared for the meeting, Maggie couldn't help but feel a mix of nerves and excitement. She didn't know where this new path would lead, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was stepping towards something meaningful. Looking at herself in the mirror, Maggie straightened her shoulders and smiled. Standing up for what was right might have cost her one job, but it had opened the door to something far greater, and she was ready to embrace it. The next morning, as the soft sunlight poured through her kitchen window, Maggie sat at her small table, sipping a warm cup of tea. The previous day's events weighed heavily on her mind, leaving a mixture of doubt and resolve in their wake. Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant rumble of an engine, followed by the crunch of tires on her gravel driveway. Peering through the curtains, Maggie froze. A sleek black car, polished to perfection, pulled to a stop in front of her modest home. Her breath caught as the driver's side door opened and a man stepped out. He was no longer the casually dressed stranger from the cafe. Today, he wore a perfectly tailored suit, exuding an air of authority and confidence. Maggie opened the door before he had a chance to knock, her heart racing. "Mr. Musk?" she stammered, recognizing him instantly. Elon Musk's warm smile greeted her. "Good morning, Maggie. May I come in?" She blinked in surprise but quickly stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "Of course, but what are you doing here?" Elon's gaze swept the cozy living room before settling back on her. "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did yesterday. Standing up to those bikers took immense courage. You didn't just stand up for me, you stood up for everyone in that cafe. That's not something many people would do." Maggie's cheeks flushed as she led him to the kitchen table. "I just did what I thought was right. Anyone would have done the same." "I disagree," Elon said, his tone earnest. "Most people would have looked the other way, but you didn't. That's why I'm here." She tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Here? Why?" Elon leaned forward, his expression soft yet serious. "I'm not just here to thank you. I'm here to offer you an opportunity. I run a foundation that supports community leaders and advocates for change. People like you, people with integrity and courage, are exactly what we need. I want you to join us." Maggie's mouth fell open, and for a moment, she could only stare at him. "Me?" she finally managed. "I've never done anything like that before." Elon's smile returned. "You already have. What you did yesterday was a perfect example of leadership and compassion. With the right resources and support, you could make an even greater impact." Her hands trembled slightly as she set her mug down. "I don't know what to say. This feels so unreal." "Take your time," he said gently. "This isn't a decision you have to make today. But know this. The world needs more people like you, Maggie. People who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." The weight of his words hung in the air as Maggie tried to process what was happening. She had spent her life serving others in small, often unnoticed ways. The idea that someone like Elon Musk believed she could do more was both humbling and overwhelming. "What would I even do?" she asked hesitantly. "You'd work with our team to identify and address issues in your community," Elon explained. "Advocate for change, support small businesses, and empower others to make a difference. It's not easy work, but it's meaningful, and I think you're perfect for it." Maggie's mind swirled with possibilities. Could she really step into such a role? She glanced at her hands, worn from years of hard work, and thought about the life she had built. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Was she ready to leave it behind for something entirely new? Elon seemed to sense her hesitation. "You don't have to decide now," he said, standing. "Here's my card. Call me if you're interested." He placed a sleek business card on the table, the minimalist design bearing only his name, a phone number, and the logo of his foundation. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. "One last thing, Maggie. Yesterday, you inspired me. Don't underestimate the power of your actions. They matter more than you know." With that, he was gone, leaving Maggie standing in her doorway, the card clutched tightly in her hand. She stared at it, her emotions a mixture of disbelief and hope. Could this really be happening? For the rest of the day, Maggie's thoughts were consumed by Elon's visit. She replayed his words over and over, trying to imagine herself in the role he had described. That night, she sat down with a notebook and began writing out her thoughts, pros and cons, fears and hopes. By the time she went to bed, one thing was clear. This opportunity wasn't just about her. It was about making a difference. The next morning, Maggie picked up the phone and dialed the number on the card. Her heart raced as the line rang, but she reminded herself of Elon's parting words. "Hello, this is Elon," came the familiar voice on the other end. Maggie took a deep breath. "It's Maggie. I'd like to take you up on your offer." Elon's smile was audible through the phone. "I knew you would. Welcome aboard, Maggie. Let's change the world together." Months later, Maggie found herself standing in front of a bustling community center. The words, "Pathway to Opportunity," proudly displayed on the building's facade. The center, funded by Tesla's Community Empowerment Initiative, was her brainchild, a project aimed at providing job training, educational resources, and support for underprivileged communities. Maggie's heart swelled with pride as she watched people of all ages stream through the doors, eager to attend classes, workshops, and mentorship programs. Her journey to this moment had been nothing short of extraordinary. After accepting Elon Musk's offer, Maggie threw herself into her new role with unwavering determination. She worked closely with Tesla's foundation team, traveling to struggling neighborhoods and listening to the stories of those who had been overlooked and underserved. Each story deepened her resolve to make a difference. But it wasn't easy. Maggie had to navigate a steep learning curve, adapting to a world of board meetings, funding proposals, and public speaking. At times, she felt out of her depth, questioning whether she was truly qualified for the role. Yet, every time doubt crept in, she reminded herself of the values that had brought her here: courage, compassion, and a belief in the power of community. One crisp autumn morning, Maggie stood in the center's newly renovated auditorium, preparing to address a group of young adults enrolled in a job training program. The room buzzed with energy as the participants settled into their seats. Maggie glanced down at her notes, then looked up, her gaze sweeping across the eager faces before her. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady and warm. "When I first started working at the Sunrise Café, I never imagined I'd be standing here today. I was a waitress for over 30 years, and I loved serving my community in small, quiet ways. But sometimes, life has a way of surprising you." The audience listened intently as Maggie recounted the story of the day that changed her life. She spoke about the bikers, the stranger who turned out to be Elon Musk, and the decision that had led her to this moment. "Standing up for what's right isn't always easy," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "But when we choose courage over fear, we can create ripples of change that reach far beyond what we can see." As she finished her speech, the room erupted into applause. Maggie smiled, her heart full. She knew that the work they were doing at the center was more than just providing resources. It was giving people hope and a sense of agency over their futures. Meanwhile, the Sunrise Café's fortunes had taken a turn for the worse. After news spread about Maggie's firing, many loyal patrons chose to boycott the diner, voicing their disapproval on social media and in local newspapers. Reviews once filled with praise for the café's warm atmosphere and excellent service now criticized its management's lack of integrity. Mr. Taylor, the café's owner, found himself overwhelmed by the backlash. Tables that were once filled with regulars now sat empty, and the vibrant hum of conversation that had defined the Sunrise Café was replaced by a heavy silence. Desperate to salvage his business, Mr. Taylor reached out to Maggie. One evening, Maggie received a phone call from her former boss. His voice was hesitant, laced with regret. "Maggie, it's Taylor. I wanted to apologize. I was wrong to fire you. You were always the heart of the cafe, and it hasn't been the same without you. Please, would you consider coming back?" Maggie's heart softened at his words, but she knew her answer. "Thank you, Mr. Taylor," she said gently. "I appreciate your apology, but I've moved on to something new. I hope you understand." After hanging up, Maggie reflected on how much her life had changed. The Sunrise Café had been her home for decades, but it no longer defined her. She was forging a new path, one that allowed her to make a broader, more meaningful impact. A few weeks later, Maggie received an invitation to attend a gala hosted by Tesla's foundation. The event, held in a grand ballroom adorned with twinkling lights and elegant decor, was a celebration of the year's accomplishments. As Maggie entered the room, she was greeted by Elon Musk, who beamed with pride. "Maggie, it's wonderful to see you," he said. "The work you've done at the community center is nothing short of incredible. You've inspired so many people, including me." Maggie smiled, humbled by his words. "Thank you, Mr. Musk. But this wouldn't have been possible without your support. You gave me the chance to believe in myself." As the evening progressed, Maggie mingled with other community leaders and advocates, sharing stories and ideas. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen and valued for who she was, and the work she was doing. By the end of the night, Maggie stood on the balcony overlooking the city skyline, reflecting on her journey. She thought about the small act of courage that had set everything in motion. It had been a leap of faith, driven by her unwavering belief in doing what was right. Sometimes, she whispered to herself, "It's the smallest acts that lead to the biggest changes." The cool breeze carried her words into the night as Maggie resolved to continue her work, knowing that the ripples of her actions would keep spreading, touching lives in ways she could only begin to imagine. Maggie's journey wasn't just about her personal success. It became a story of resilience, kindness, and the ripple effect one person's actions can have on an entire community. Every day, she reflected on the pivotal morning at the Sunrise Café, recognizing that courage isn't simply about standing up to others. True courage lies in standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against you. Months after the grand opening of the Pathway to Opportunity Community Center, Maggie's life had transformed in ways she could never have anticipated. Her work with Tesla's foundation was thriving, and the community center was buzzing with activity. Job training workshops, literacy programs, and mentorship initiatives were helping countless individuals chart new paths for their futures. But beyond the tangible successes, Maggie had cultivated something even more powerful: hope. One sunny afternoon, Maggie found herself standing in the center's bustling courtyard. A group of children laughed as they planted flowers in the community garden, their hands dirty but their spirits high. Nearby, a young woman named Clara approached Maggie with a bright smile. "Ms. Maggie, I wanted to thank you," Clara said, holding up a certificate. "I just completed the job training program, and I got hired at the library. I've always dreamed of working there." Maggie's eyes sparkled with pride. "That's wonderful, Clara. You earned this. I'm so proud of you." Clara nodded, her voice soft with emotion. "I wouldn't have done it without you. You believed in me when no one else did." Moments like these reminded Maggie why she had taken this leap of faith. The center wasn't just a place for programs and resources. It was a sanctuary where people felt seen, valued, and supported. Maggie had become a symbol of perseverance and kindness, and her story inspired those around her to dream bigger and strive harder. While Maggie thrived in her new role, the impact of her actions continued to ripple outward. One day, she was invited to speak at a statewide conference on community empowerment. The event was attended by educators, nonprofit leaders, and business executives eager to learn from her experiences. Standing behind the podium, Maggie glanced at the sea of faces before her. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she began to speak. "When I was a waitress at the Sunrise Café, I thought my life was ordinary. I never imagined that a single moment of courage could change everything. But what I've learned is that small acts of kindness can create waves of change." Maggie recounted her journey, sharing the lessons she had learned about resilience, the importance of community, and the power of standing up for what's right. Her words resonated deeply, drawing a standing ovation as she concluded her speech. Later that evening, a man approached her in the conference's networking lounge. "Ms. Maggie," he said, extending a hand, "your story moved me. My name is Richard, and I'm the CEO of Bright Futures, an organization that supports rural education initiatives. We've been looking for someone with your passion and vision to join our advisory board. Would you consider it?" Maggie's heart swelled with gratitude. She smiled warmly. "I'd be honored, Richard. Thank you for believing in me." Back in her hometown, Maggie's legacy continued to grow. Word of her achievements spread, and people who had once doubted her began to see her in a new light. Even Mr. Taylor, the owner of the Sunrise Café, found himself reflecting on the choices he had made. One afternoon, Mr. Taylor visited the community center. Nervously clutching a bouquet of flowers, he approached Maggie, who was organizing supplies in the lobby. "Maggie," he began, his voice tinged with regret. "I came to say I'm sorry. I should have supported you that day instead of letting my fear get the best of me. I see now how wrong I was." Maggie looked at him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she smiled and accepted the flowers. "Thank you, Mr. Taylor. It means a lot to hear that. And for what it's worth, I hope the cafe finds its way back to what it used to be, a place where people feel welcome." As the months turned into years, Maggie's work continued to evolve. She launched new initiatives, including a scholarship program for local students and a small business incubator to support aspiring entrepreneurs. Each project brought new challenges, but Maggie faced them with the same courage and determination that had carried her through that fateful day at the diner. At the heart of it all was her unwavering belief in the power of kindness. During a televised interview, Maggie summarized her philosophy: kindness is contagious. When we choose to act with compassion, we inspire others to do the same. And that's how we create lasting change, one small act at a time. Her words struck a chord with viewers across the nation. Letters poured in from people who had been touched by her story, sharing their own experiences of courage and kindness. Maggie made it a point to respond to as many as she could, knowing that her journey was not just her own but part of a larger movement. One crisp winter evening, the community center hosted its annual holiday celebration. The building was alive with laughter, music, and the aroma of home-cooked meals. Maggie stood near the entrance, greeting visitors and handing out scarves to children as they arrived. As the night unfolded, Maggie found herself drawn to the community garden, now adorned with twinkling fairy lights. She stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. Families coming together, neighbors sharing stories, and children playing without a care in the world. "Ms. Maggie," a young boy's voice called out, pulling her from her thoughts. He held up a small card decorated with glitter and crayons. "This is for you. My mom says you're a hero." Maggie knelt to accept the card, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you, sweetheart. But you know what? The real heroes are people like your mom, who make the world a better place every day." As the boy ran off to join his friends, Maggie clutched the card to her chest, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Her journey had taken her far from where she had started, but her purpose remained the same: to make a difference, one small act of kindness at a time. That night, as she watched the community she had helped build thrive, Maggie knew that the power of kindness was limitless. It didn't just change her life, it changed the lives of everyone it touched. And for Maggie, that was the greatest success of all.